Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Brian Peterson, and today I want to talk just briefly about a question that has often come up in classes and in discussions about Genesis 1 and 2. The major issue of Genesis 1 and 2, is it myth or is it history? That has been the dominant question that has been asked or leveled against these two particular texts. But I want to look at something slightly different, and that is, can we interpret these texts not necessarily in light of Mesopotamian origins, but can we look at these texts in light of possible Egyptian origins? In other words, and I know this is not popular, but is it possible that somebody like a Moses figure is the one behind these texts? And there's a reason why I say that, and it has to do with the way the texts themselves are put together and the way they present creation. Now, in Genesis chapter 1, the general scholarly consensus is that this is a chapter that was written by the priestly source, the putative priestly source that was probably written in 500 or later, 500 BC or later. In this particular case, the basic argument is it's presenting God as being outside of time, that God is transcendent. He doesn't get his hands dirty when he creates simply by speaking. And so therefore, those would be things that the priestly authors would be interested in. Conversely, when you look at Genesis chapter 2, what you get is a picture of Yahweh Elohim, God, from a very different perspective. You get a perspective that God gets his hands dirty. He gets down on his hands and knees, so to speak, and he fashions humanity out of the dirt of the ground, and he breathes the breath of life into him. Very much an imminent presentation of who God is. And so scholars have looked at these two sides and they said, look, it's obviously two different authors. But I think that what I am seeing in this may give a little or shed a little bit more light on this topic when we look at it through the lens of ancient Egypt. Now, I understand that in the era of Pan-Babylonianism a few years ago, especially in the 20th century, this was very common, where everything in the Bible was connected to Babylon and its roots in the exilic period. What I have argued, or what I would want to argue, is it possible that we should go back and look at the Egyptian context? Now, again, let me look at those two chapters. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this in this opening video, but I do want to at least get you thinking about it. And so this has come out of some of my work in archaeology. I've done archaeology for a number of years in Israel up until the COVID crisis. One of the things that I notice is that in Egyptian mythology, you actually have a number of creator deities. Two of the dominant ones, especially in the 18th dynasty, and this is a common way of dating the Exodus, for example, that the 18th dynasty in the period of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II were perhaps the pharaohs of the Exodus. And so from the 18th dynasty. Now, the 19th dynasty is from the period of Ramses II, and that's what was often known as the late date in the 13th century. But let's just look at it for a minute from the 18th dynasty and what is the 15th century. It just happens in that particular time period, we have two major creator deities, and they have begun to subsume under the same heading of Amun. Amun was the creator deity, or one of the major creator deities. He's masculine. And the other creator deity is Khnum, K-H-N-U-M, and he was obviously also masculine. And at that particular time, they began to subsume, and their image was the ram, often presented as the ram-headed god. And this is where it's kind of connected to my archaeology. A few years ago, a place called Khirbet el-Maqadir, I excavated with ABR, Associates for Biblical Research, a small little bronze ram's head that was obviously from some type of an idol figure. And again, it's for another discussion, but what I found interesting is that the whole concept of the ram god, Khnum, and Amun as creator deities, Amun, who had a lot of connections also with the creator deity Ptah, P-T-A-H, he actually creates by speaking. And so in the 18th dynasty, these were the common creation myths. And so you had one created by speaking. Now the other creator deity, Khnum, again, subsumed under Amun, he was presented as creating as a potter. Matter of fact, you can Google Khnum and see that he is often depicted with a potter's wheel at his feet, and he usually has the pharaoh or somebody on the potter's wheel creating them. And then he breathes the breath of life into them and so forth. And so what I want to argue is it possible that what we have here is in Genesis chapter 1, a Moses figure is arguing, look, in ancient Egypt, these are the creation myths that you have heard about. And the one speaks creation into existence merely by the spoken word, and the other one creates as a potter. But the author is basically re-educating the group of Israelites and saying, hey, look, I want to tell you who the true creator deity is, and he is the creator who also speaks things into creation or into being. And that is a God named Elohim. Now, it's a very generic term that's used here in Genesis. And in Genesis chapter 1, Elohim is a common term. It's used across the ancient culture. It's kind of like today us using the term God. And same way in our English translations, this is the way it's translated, just with the G-O-D. And when it's speaking of Yahweh, it is, or the heavenly God, it's capitalized. And so in this case, he's using a very generic term, and he's saying, look, the creator deity is not Ptah. It is actually the creator deity of the heavens, and that is none other than Elohim. Now, the reason for using Elohim would have been probably because a great mixed multitude came up with Israel out of Egypt, and so they're learning as well. Remember, Genesis is Torah, it's instruction, and so they're learning as well. And so in this particular case, what they're doing with it is the author, what he's doing is he's trying to say, hey, that use of Elohim is so everybody can connect who that God is. Now, in chapter 2, he's going to be very specific on that deity. And so the terms in Hebrew that are used for creation there are bara and asa. Those are the two dominant terms. And one is this idea of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. It is used of God. The other one is asa, usually to create something out of pre-existing matter. And so that's chapter 1. In chapter 2, however, you get this picture of God creating, but the God that's creating is Yahweh Elohim. It's a compound phrase in Hebrew, and it is only used, almost or exclusively used here in chapters 2 to 4. It's used another time over in Exodus, but for the most part, this is the concentration of it. And so it's that compound of Yahweh Elohim. So it is like the author is saying, hey, you know who the Elohim is of chapter 1? Let me tell you, it is Yahweh Elohim. It is Yahweh God. And he said, you want to know how he created humanity? And so I don't necessarily agree that chapters 1 or 2 are in conflict. And again, we can have another video and talk more about that. But what I argue is that what's going on in chapter 1 is the kind of the general creation of the universe. And then in chapter 2, it's like the author has taken a snippet, and he's taking chapter 1, verses 26 through 28 or 27 to 28, and the creation of humanity. And he is now fleshing that out. And he's saying, this is how I did it. And so this is not necessarily a creation of the earth again, a different creation presentation. It is kind of zeroing in on humanity. And so what he is doing there is he's using that language in the Hebrew of the potter. Yatsar is the term that it's used, where it says that God, Yahweh Elohim, Yatsar, he created as a potter. Yotzer is the term that's normally for potter. Now again, where this connects with the ancient Egypt mythology is the fact that Khnum, the god of Egypt, who was a creator deity as well, he created on the potter's wheel. And so here is this Moses figure, or the author, saying, look, this is what you've heard, but I want to correct it. What we actually have is Yahweh Elohim is the one who creates, and Yahweh is the one who breathes the breath of life into humanity. Now, again, what's interesting is that in ancient Egypt, Khnum was seen as creating Pharaoh, breathing life into him, and placing him as the co-regent on the earth. And what does God do, Yahweh Elohim, in chapter 2? He takes his new creation fashioned out of clay as the potter, breathes life into him, and places him in a garden and to be his co-regent. And of course, later he's going to create Eve as the helpmeet. And so what we have here is these two creation presentations. One is a deity who creates by speaking. One is a deity who creates by fashioning as a potter. And so I don't think these are in conflict. I think what they're doing is this is a Moses figure or the author of Genesis trying to present Torah instruction and saying here in chapter 1, we have what you think is the creator Ptah, and in essence, it is Elohim. And in the second section, what we have is the presentation of the other creation myth, only it is clarified, demythologized, and say it is Yahweh who does this, Yahweh Elohim. It is not the god Khnum. Now, I really think a Moses figure could have done this because we actually have very clear evidence of this from the excavations in Egypt, where we have the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, who I think is actually probably a good candidate for the stepmother, or the adoptive mother, I should say, of Moses. And they would make their mortuary temples long before they died. And on that mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, we actually have 8 different panels of Khnum creating on his potter's wheel. And so here is probably young Moses in tow with his stepmom coming in and showing him, and he would have seen this. All of this imagery would have been very prevalent in the minds of the Israelites, and especially in the mind of Moses. And so I think what he is doing is he's saying, look to the audience, this is what you have heard, but I think what we actually have here is something very different. I think that we have a picture, not of mythology, but of what actually happened. And he uses these 2 pictures that the Israelites would have understood. And then he says, but it is not mythology in the sense of these other deities that are doing it. It is none other than the God that we are entering into covenant with, none other than Yahweh himself. And so Yahweh is the one who is the Elohim who creates by speaking, but he is also the God who creates by fashioning. I think when we read the text through this lens, and when we look at the Egyptian connections, it matches much better than the Babylonian parallels. And it actually explains why these 2 creation accounts are there. So hopefully this has helped explain that. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. My email address is bpeterson@leeuniversity.edu. And if you, like I said, more than willing to have a conversation. If not, I'll see you next time when we tackle another difficult issue.